This House is now in session.
Announcements by Your Honour.
Minutes of Tuesday, the 25th of September.
The Honourable House of Assembly at its meeting of Tuesday, the 25th of September 2018, which have been circulated, be taken as read.
If there are no corrections or observations, then let the aforesaid minutes stand confirmed.
Messages from Her Excellency the Governor General. Petitions. Papers. Government notices. Private members' notices. Notice of questions. Reports from select committees. First reading of bills. Statements by ministers. Congratulatory and/or obituary speeches. Personal explanations. Motions for leave of absence. Or replies to questions. Notice of motion for adjournment of the House on matters of urgent public importance. Orders of the day.
I beg to move that standing orders numbers 6, 16, 18, 20, 42.5, 43 and 44 be suspended for the remainder of the day's sitting.
Question is that the aforementioned standing orders be suspended for the remainder of the day's sitting. All those honourable members in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. We think the ayes have it. Government business is now the order of the day.
Order number 2, sir. Order number 2, in the name of the Honourable Attorney General, to move the second reading of the Law Revision and Law Reform Bill 2018.
Our member for St. Joseph.
Mr. Speaker, there are some bills that come before this Parliament that don't really have the capacity to excite the public, perhaps even some of my parliamentary colleagues. I have the honour, though, I suppose, of moving the second reading of a bill which could be put into that particular category. And this bill, Mr. Speaker, is a bill entitled the Law Revision and Law Reform Act of 2018. Mr. Speaker, I hardly think that there's a day that passes in Barbados when, either on a calling program or in a rum shop or a churchyard, anywhere, that somebody does not utter those words, the law wants changing. Of course, sir, the changing of laws is not just the action of coming to Parliament and passing a law. It requires a tremendous amount of work before that. But in addition to changing the law, there are also a lot of elements which arise in relation to existing laws. And in the next few minutes, sir, I hope to give this chamber and the wider public some brief insight into the whole matter of law reform, what drives it, law revision and what that entails. And hopefully, at the end of this debate, we will have put a piece of legislation in place which more readily allows Barbados to have modern laws at all times as we face the challenging but exciting decades ahead. Perhaps, Mr. Speaker, the easiest one to look at is the matter of law revision. Law revision, sir, will involve coming to Parliament, it is true. But there are many elements of law revision that are of integral importance to the legislative process and to the laws of Barbados that have to be kept under review at all times. Mr. Speaker, as a prominent and eminent member of the bar, I'm sure that you have opened a particular piece of legislation from time to time and found that it doesn't quite read right. Maybe there's a piece of punctuation missing. Maybe there's a word there that is repeated. Maybe there's a grammatical error, and sometimes even spelling errors. Certainly in this chamber, since we have started this particular term, there have been instances when we've had to amend bills on the floor for precisely those kinds of reasons. But they're not always noticed. More easily noticed if the bill consists of 20 or 30 sections. More easily noticed, sir, if it is something of tremendous importance and everybody reads it down to the last finest detail. But, sir, in a bill even like this, where I can't imagine that there's a whole lot of excitement about it, it is quite possible that grammatical and spelling errors might pass through this House and not even be noticed in the upper house. Law revision, therefore, allows, Mr. Speaker, for a process where our statutes are constantly kept under review, and it is a process where you are principally concerned with the accuracy and the clarity of the law. As I said, some of the mistakes that may be made in drafting may only be discovered when brilliant lawyers like yourself start to argue the fine details of a particular section of an act before the court, and then you might discover clearly this was a mistake. Law revision, therefore, allows us to deal with those. Inconsistencies in language, omissions which render the law unclear, those kinds of things. Now, sir, of course, you have to have an individual who will be responsible for the day-to-day task of law revision. That person is known as a law revision commissioner. Now, it has been many years since we've had a functioning law revision commissioner in Barbados. I don't remember the name of the gentleman who did it before. But certainly, when I last sat in the chair as Attorney General, we did have a law revision, an individual who was in charge of law revision. And his thankless task was to sit at a desk behind the scenes, an unsung hero, sir, meticulously going through every single statute and making sure that the product at the end of his process was clear and expressed the full intention of Parliament. His job was also, Mr. Speaker, to wed amendments to statutes, to the existing statutes. Very much, sir, the way you would add on a room to a house, this Parliament comes to court and makes an amendment to a piece of legislation that might have been wrong for 5 years, but sometimes around for 50 years. But the two have to be wedded together seamlessly and perfectly. But because you're making the amendment sometimes many years pass, it doesn't exactly fit, because even the way in which you draft and express the English language changes over time. There was a time, sir, when statutes used to have adjectives in them. So they would talk about the abominable this and the abominable that. Not snowman, sir. But of that era, the drafters were at liberty to express the error of Parliament over particular things. That was how they drafted then. Can you imagine this Parliament today making an amendment to such a law when today we don't use that kind of descriptive language? We don't speak the same way, we don't write the same way, we don't express things in the same way. So what you will end up, sir, with is a strange amalgam where a statute passed in the 1960s, amended today, might not exactly come out the way it should. Law revision is involved, sir, in putting those two things together. And part of that exercise, sir, is publishing a revised laws of Barbados on a periodic basis. The last time we published, I think, a consolidated set of laws was over 9 years ago. Over 9 years ago, sir. So that if, I don't know if any of my parliamentary colleagues this sitting have received the generosity of the Speaker by being given a set of laws. But, sir, the fact is that if there were, they'd be given a set of laws that was last printed in consolidated form almost a decade ago. But every year since then, amendments have been made. So what you would pick up in a blue volume is not necessarily what expresses the law as at today's date. So a person picking up a blue volume of our laws and reading something from the Property Act then has to inquire, have there been any amendments which might be relevant? But precisely because we've not had a law review commissioner engaged in the exercise of importing into the existing statute subsequent amendments and deleting the sections that were there before, we've not been able to produce a consolidated set of laws. Now the truth is, sir, on that regard, and perhaps I digress briefly, I think the time is upon us when we simply have to, I don't think we should do away with our paper volumes. Personally, I much prefer to read a statute. I much prefer to read anything in its physical form rather than its digital form. But at the same time, sir, having an electronic version of the laws of Barbados appeals to a whole new generation of practitioners. Sir, you know, I know many a young lawyer who, when I told them, pass me the laws of Barbados, it's almost like it was an alien document to them. They would more readily pull it up on their computer and work with it that way. That doesn't quite work for me, but to each his own. But the fact is, you can't beat having your laws online. You can't beat it, sir, in terms of access. And we have to come to the place where we recognize that there are people all across the world who are interested in knowing what our laws on particular subjects are. And they can go, I can go online and find in a particular place all the laws of Canada, all the laws, well, I wouldn't like to say all the laws of the United States, because that is such a, that is, but the point is they're there. If I want to find a statute in England, I just go online and find it. But if you want to find the laws of Barbados online, and you Google it, sir, perhaps you've tried it before, you might well find that you're directed to a FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization website, which would, and you will download the laws of Barbados, the particular statute you want, from a FAO website or a WTO website. But you would not find a website run by the government of Barbados, except, and I don't even think Parliament has it, but you know, you got to go on to Parliament to get it. But the point is, you know, we ought to have a dedicated place where the laws of Barbados in their current form are to be found. But even so, sir, even so, in taking into account all of the amendments, it's just not there. So law revision as an exercise is vital to the law, sir. Now, we have to remember that the days are long past us when the average Barbadian is willing to wait until they go and talk to an expert about something. Barbadians have now, and I'm proud of this, we've now become experts in just about everything. But it speaks, sir, to the level of access to information and the level of interest and inclination that we have to pursue things that are not ordinarily within our realm of learning and training. So teachers now will readily engage me in what a particular act says, because they take the trouble to go and find it and read it. There was a time when the only people knowledgeable about the law were considered to be practitioners like you and myself, judges, lawyers, magistrates. But those days are long past, sir. Every single Barbadian who is engaged in farming needs to be able to pick up every single statute that deals in any way with farming and be able to understand clearly what the law says and how it impacts on him. There are some things in relation to interpretation, there's some nice rules that you and I would be aware of that he might not. But the point is, we have to make all of our statutes accessible to our people. There's no reason why not. Because at the end of the day, a better informed public is a public that better relates to the society and that better relates to the structures of governance. You can't have it any other way, sir. And we've spent too much money educating our people than to have them feel that there are things that are not available to them, sir. My children are at the university. Well, one at university, one at BCC. And I guess because buying books is the only thing I know, when they first started, I said, so we gotta buy some books. So I do not think that my daughter has brought home more than 4 books in her entire time so far at campus. Every single thing that she reads is online. Everything. I mean, and that is, it's not a reality that I like, but it is the reality of our modern digital society. Everything that we are delivering to our population is in an online format. I think they're missing out an awful lot. I have the pleasure, sir, of going back to every single one of my textbooks because I kept them. And I remember, I can go and I can see what was underlined or what I highlighted. And when I put some perhaps slightly rude comments because I can understand it or because I disagree. But you know, those are as much a part of me, sir, as my clothing. I have them and I'm proud still to have them. Some of them are dated, published back in 1976. Because as a student, I was forced to buy second-hand books. So you know, those were the ones that were out of print. And I know you had the same experience, Mr. Speaker. Couldn't afford to buy the new ones, you buy the old ones. But the fact is that our statutes, just like any other tool, any other information, is going to have to be put online and in an updated format. And that is what law revision entails. And we need to be able to update our statutes as fast as it happens, so that the moment the Senate passes its bill that has already gone through our hands, and it is proclaimed, then at the click of a button, those amendments ought to be immediately and seamlessly put into our existing statute. But the process now is a manual one. So, Mr. Speaker, the law revision exercise is one that is very important. We have money in our budget this year for a law revision commissioner. And the Attorney General's Chambers is anxious to advertise for that post to be filled so that we can recruit the kind of intellectual and diligence, the kind of individual that has the intellectual bent, because it requires a lot of attention to detail. It's not a flamboyant area of law, sir, not at all. And in fact, it doesn't, you know, we need somebody who can go into the minutiae of a statute and help us to make sure that it is correct, then it reaches the hands of the public and the practitioners. So upon the passing of this bill in both chambers and it's coming into law, we would expect to be able to invite applications to fill the post of Law Revision Commissioner, sir. But that is perhaps the day-to-day bread and butter of law revision. Perhaps, sir, the more important element of this bill is that of a law review commissioner. Now, for small states like ours, this takes on tremendous significance. Small states are small in population, small in resource bases. But the fact is, sir, our society needs very much the same kinds of law, and perhaps in some respects even the same amounts of law as England or Mauritius or the United States. Even though we are a small state, Mr. Speaker, we do not have the luxury of saying small state means that we don't need as much law. It doesn't work that way, sir. Because when you are dealing, for example, with a corporate climate, we have to have a Companies Act that embodies all of the current legal thinking that allows us to operate on the same footing as our trading partners, that recognizes the same commercial concepts as our trading partners and as people who we want to trade with us. And therefore it means that we have to recognize the same instruments and concepts as they do. And we are therefore in an environment where, in order to be competitive, we have to put modern company laws, modern insurance laws in place. Just because we're a small country doesn't mean that our law can be second best or that our law need not be as comprehensive. It is true, I will grant, that there are some things that are alien to our environment that we might not want to incorporate, and we get to decide what we want to. But the fact of the matter is, Mr. Speaker, that we still need, and especially this globalizing environment, to make sure that our legislative framework is on all fours with many nations across the board. There was perhaps a time, Mr. Speaker, when we did not even contemplate having legislation dealing with the proceeds of crime. There was a time, Mr. Speaker, when we did not contemplate having anti-terrorism legislation. I invite you to think about it with me, sir. There are some of us who were alive and well remember the Cubana bombing. There are some, and we know firsthand what that loss of life entailed. I'm sure that everybody in this chamber would remember the news stories of and particularly gruesome news stories of body parts being brought ashore in Moseses, and I assume the plural of a Moses is Moseses. It can't be Mosai or mosaics. But the fact is, we all remember that. But other than that, terrorism is not something that Barbados thinks about ordinarily. We just don't. We've not had any bombings in our capitals. We've not had any cars driving through crowds seeking to maim and kill. We've not had it. But the fact is that we are in a globalizing environment where terrorists and terrorist suspects are operating in neighboring Trinidad. Neighboring Trinidad, sir. I think colleagues might remember only last year, no, this year I believe, only this year, there was a report of a terrorist plot to disrupt Carnival. It was a credible threat. It was looked into, it was fully investigated, and people were even taken into custody. And that is in Trinidad, sir. Trinidad. 45 minutes away by plane And we must not think that because we are a small, God-fearing society, hardly ever hit by a hurricane, and we are God's own people, that we will not at any time fall onto the radar of terrorist suspects. We may. So even though terrorism is not something that the risk of terrorism is not something that we wake up every morning and worry about, we still are obligated to have laws which effectively allow us to deal with it. Plain and simple. But we are also in an environment, Mr. Speaker, where we've signed on to a lot of treaties. And these treaties, and we signed on to them in good faith, require us also to have statutes which deal with the many risks. So even though we may be a small country, and even though we always operate on a risk-based approach, the fact is that we need to have exactly the same kind of laws dealing with terrorism financing, and dealing with the allied areas such as money laundering and so on, and civil confiscation of assets from criminals and so on. We need to have that same set of legislation as a country with 300 times our population, and as a country with 1,000 times our GNP. That's the reality. But what we don't have is resources. The Chief Parliamentary Counsel's office, which falls under the Attorney General's chambers, has a staff, sir, consisting of a Chief Parliamentary Counsel, a Deputy Chief Parliamentary Counsel, 7 Senior Parliamentary Counsel and Parliamentary Counsel combined, and 2 posts of Legislative Crown Counsel. So that is 1 and 2 is 3, and 7 is 9, and 2 is 11. So we have 11 people responsible for drafting all of the laws of Barbados, when in England they might have 2,000 people doing it. That's our reality. We are resource poor, but we still have to bring on the table of Parliament every day that we sit some law which is connected to our international obligations. Mr. Speaker, we are currently dealing with meeting the obligations in relation to anti-money laundering and anti-terrorism financing, which is the watchdog of which, sir, is the Financial Action Task Force, and we have a regional body called the Caribbean Financial Action Task Force. And whether we like it or not, we have to amend our laws so that we meet those international obligations. Because we are now in an environment where we are dealing with global movement of money. And if we think that Barbadian companies and Barbadian banks are not being used for money laundering, think again, sir. Think again. And it's not just the local people involved in criminal activity who might be doing money laundering. We know about that. But it is also people using our jurisdiction because they feel that we are not as focused, that we are not as tight on supervision, so they could get away with something in Barbados and send money through Barbados without it being adequately scrutinized. So that requires us to ensure that we have modern laws on those areas, even though our risk is low, even though our country is smaller as the big countries, sir. No, this is not something that we may want to accept. In fact, sometimes it is a little bit galling to think that we have to contort ourselves to pass laws and find ways of enforcing them, when really it is the metropoles, it is the New Yorks and the Chicagos and the Hong Kongs that the billions of dollars that money launderers are going through. The banking system of Barbados, as far as I think the statistics show, that the movement of money does not yet exceed $5 billion a year. 5 billion, sir. Thank you. But yet still, we have to put in place statutes where companies in some of those countries move more money than our entire banking system. It's galling, sir. But Barbados cannot throw up a wall around itself and operate as if we are in a cocoon, untouched by what happens around us. In addition, sir, law review and a law review commissioner allows us to keep pace not just with the harsher side of things, but with developments in the law. Mr. Speaker, you well recollect there was a time when the criminal law recognized the doctrine, I think it was of common intention, where if you, well, no, let me not say you, where if a group of people went to rob a man, 10 people went to rob a man, and one of them get vexed in a violent rage and stab him and kill him, everybody was convicted of murder. The doctrine of common intention. All of them went to do a criminal act, and in the course of this criminal act, the man dead, all of you are culpable. And that was unassailable law for many, many decades. Unassailable law for many decades. But the thinking began to change probably in the 80s with early dissenting judgments, and then by the 90s it became crystallized, so that I think our first case with that was probably in the late 90s or maybe early 2000s. Okay? So the point is, law doesn't just change because we want to change it. Law changes because the prevailing legal reasoning moves from one paradigm to another. Now, sir, we've had a Companies Act which I think was passed in 1980, came into force in 1982, sir. And at the time when we passed our Companies Act, it was a Companies Act that was based on Canadian law, but it was a Caribbean model law. So a model law was prepared based on the Canadian Business Companies Act. And that law was eventually adopted all across the Caribbean, more or less along the same lines. There may be one or two variations to suit local circumstances, but more or less around the same, following the same basic principles and lines. You will find that the Companies Act across the English-speaking Caribbean is identical. But sir, that act is now going on 40 years old. In that 40 years, that act has been construed in areas that the original drafters did not even contemplate. But not just that, prevailing views about certain company law fundamentals have also changed. And the countries with which we are trading have amended their laws to suit. But here's how the legislative process works in Barbados, Mr. Speaker. And I'm not criticizing it because it is one that I don't know there's any other way of doing it. A government ministry, either because of representations made to it or by dint of research and so on done in-house, or in response to some external conditions, a government ministry will say, we want to change our law to do this. That minister's staff will they'll do their research, prepare policy papers, consult, and then at the end of that process, sir, they will come to cabinet and say, we want to change the law or to pass a new law on this area, and this is what we want it to say, and this is how it would operate. That cabinet paper, when approved, then goes to the Chief Parliamentary Council. And the Chief Parliamentary Council is tasked with taking policy. I was never too. I reminded sir that it wasn't called common intent, it was joint enterprise. But or
common design.
The chamber.
Or common design.
Common design. Common design. So it was all, but you understand what I was saying. The principle was correct. Well, my description of it was unfortunately incorrect. Happily, most lawyers are at court and not listening to this particular.
Criminal lawyers would understand it.
I think they would, sir. But the point is that the company, so it then goes to the Chief Parliamentary Council. The Chief Parliamentary Council gets what's called a policy paper, and based on that policy paper, the Chief Parliamentary Council begins to draft the legislation. It can take long if it is a subject matter that is new and unfamiliar. They have to look and see how this particular law works in Mauritius, how this particular law works in other parts of the Commonwealth, how it works in non-Commonwealth parts, and try to come up with a structure. And that's reviewed and so on. But it's a process, sir, that is driven by the policymakers. Driven by the policymakers. Now, Mr. Speaker, when there's an aside there, it was just written. Mr. Speaker, so what happens though is, because it is driven by policymakers, it is not necessarily timely. With a law review commission and a law review commissioner, we will be establishing an entity which will be tasked, which will be given the responsibility of keeping, I suppose, all of our laws, but we would expect them to deal with the major instruments, the major statutes, and see what changes have been made, and making recommendations, including possible drafts, to the policymakers, and say they'll be saying to us cabinet ministers, this is how the law has changed in relation to company law. This is how the law has changed in relation to maritime delimitation. This is how it has changed in relation to defense forces, whatever it is. And some will work for us, some won't, but we want to recommend to you that you consider taking the law in this direction. So we will now have an agency operating across all of Barbados, and not in a particular ministry, but it will have all of our laws under review and will advise government on the direction that we need to go. Now, sir, that will take a lot of the headache out of the ministries, because you will now have an agency that will be staffed appropriately, as long as so far as finances allow, which will then, Mr. Speaker, be able to, as I hate to use this kind of language, but which will feed into what we do as a government, in a way, Mr. Speaker, that perhaps the administrative arms of our respective ministries will not be able to do. Now, sir, laws are changing rapidly. There's no country that can take the view that they can wait until they get around to it. Because what happens is you will find yourself playing by one set of rules, while all of the other people in the world playing another set of rules. We can be playing one kind of cricket when they're playing a different kind of cricket. You know what can happen? They can say, well, sorry, your laws are not up to date, and we are not going to be bringing our investments into Barbados. Your laws are not up to date, so we're not going to be migrating our offshore businesses to Barbados. Simple. That's how it works, sir. So law review is a vital, remember there's law revision, which deals with corrections and grammar and those kind of things. Law review then takes us into the macro. It allows us, through this agency, to keep all of our laws under constant review. That's all they'll be doing on a day-to-day basis, and helping us to track the direction that the law is moving in, so that Barbados will be able, as best as possible, to stay current with trends. No, sir, I know that for some people that may seem as though we are following a pattern, as though we are trying to keep up with somebody else. But we can't bury our heads in the sands. We operate in a globalized world. And trade is now being done simultaneously. People will make decisions about Barbados about things that we may not even consider. So if you take the Town Planning Acts, our first passed in the 1960s, we have made some slight amendments to it. But at no time except now has there been an exercise in trying to determine whether what constitutes our town planning legislation is still current for a modern Barbados. We've not done that. Had we had a law review commissioner and a law review commission, that entity would be responsible, among other things, for pointing us in new directions as far as town planning legislation is concerned. And let me say, we will not be operating in a silo. There are a large number of resources that are available to us. In the Commonwealth, other international bodies, where Barbados participates in so many international fora, sometimes it's not funny. But we have the knowledge of what's happening, but we don't have a good mechanism for moving that knowledge into current modern legislation. And as I say, town planning, sir, is just one of those instances where had we had a law review process, our town plan, we would not be in a position today where we have a town planning statute that is cumbersome and not really able to meet our economic requirements for today. Now, sir, I'm not asking this chamber to reinvent the wheel. Not at all. I can say to the chamber that there are law review commissions in other agencies, other countries in the Commonwealth. In terms of small states, sir, the Bahamas has a statutory law review commission. The BVI does, Cayman Islands, Dominica, Trinidad and Tobago. Further afield in the small states of CARICOM, you have Fiji, Jersey, Lesotho, Mauritius, Namibia, Papua New Guinea, Samoa, Solomon Islands, Tonga, and others. But the good old motherland has in fact been leading the way in this area for many, many years. And they have produced law review commission reports, which are substantive documents. And they don't just sit down and try to figure out, let's carry the law here. They engage in public consultations. So they will talk to the bar, they will talk to the practitioners. They will examine the law, and they would recommend reasons why it should be changed. They would look at how the cases have interpreted statutes and try to come up with a considered view as to whether that is right or wrong, whether it should be followed, or whether it should be departed from. So we're not trying to reinvent the wheel. But nor are we trying to follow suit. This is important for us because we really have to have a system where our laws are kept under constant review, but it has to be done in a way that is, in the beginning, not a political one. Now, let me explain what I mean, sir. All of us in cabinet are members of the political class, whether you're in the Senate or the lower house. Government policy is necessarily going to be driven by politicians, but that's who we are. And we will try to make decisions about that policy, taking into account the larger needs, but there's also somebody who is thinking about how will this affect my constituents. And that's not bad, because we were elected to represent their interests. So we can't come in here or sit in the cabinet and make decisions about our country without constantly looking back, as if there's an imaginary gallery of people from St. George. If I'm imagining my biggest critics in St. George behind me now, you know. And if I say "am" too many times in my speech, I will probably have telephone calls tomorrow saying I didn't like your speech. But as important as the way in which I deliver it has to do with whether what I'm doing meets their interests. Is that what they sent me to Parliament for? So we are politicians. And whatever we do will be driven by politics. But sir, I don't have any big businesses in St. Joseph. I don't. I have a few failing farms, some struggling hotels. I have a lot of shopkeepers. That's my reality. On the other hand, though, one of my parliamentary colleagues might represent a constituency. If I take the member for St. Lucie, for example, the Awa cement plant employs 200 people in St. Lucie. So as he carries out his political duty, he has to ask himself, the Awa cement plant that employs my constituents is also, in a manner of speaking, a constituent. And therefore I have to ask myself, if you employ 200 people and 150 of those came, I think Parliament is trying to conserve electricity, sir. So they're reducing the number of light bulbs that are working. Some of my colleagues said that it was my hot air that caused the bulb to blow. I don't understand, so I would like you to caution the members. Tell them leave me alone. But the point is, sir, that we all have these constituencies to protect. So the member for St. Lucie will have to ask himself, what is it that's good for my 150 constituents that work there? And another member who may represent a large number of agricultural workers, the member for St. George, the members for St. George, for example, will have to ask themselves, is the direction that I want to take the law satisfying the needs of my constituents? People, colleagues who have large population concentrations will have to ask themselves, is what I'm thinking of as a policy something that's going to negatively or positively affect those constituents? So they're all political interests that we have to cater to. And that is why we are here. But if I do not have constituents from a particular sector, then it isn't going to be in the forefront of my mind. So the minister responsible for agriculture, his focus is going to have to be agriculture. If his constituents are not in the agriculture belt, then he may be thinking something differently. So we can't get away from the politics of our position. We are politicians. That's how we got here. And it is important that we always recognize that, sir. But the fact is that the Law Review Commission takes us out of the political realm. Takes us out of the political realm, sir. And therefore allows an impartial view, a view uncolored by political considerations, to come to bear on what is happening in terms of the development of the law and present it to us for our informed consideration. Now, sir, we've come this far with the system that we have. But given the fact that sometimes we don't necessarily have the expertise that we need to guide our deliberations, then we have to accept that there are other people out there whose services we may have to buy in to influence that. Now, this is not alien to what we do here, but what we're seeking to do is to give it a structure, to employ a team of specialized people who will be able to deal with our statutory needs and our legislative needs going forward. This will not supplant the work of the Chief Parliamentary Counsel's office. In fact, I believe that the Chief Parliamentary Counsel and her office are enthusiastic about this particular process because it will be an analysis of law made by experts. Well, perhaps I use the word expert a little too freely, sir. But the point is, it'll be made by a dedicated agency. The fact is, Mr. Speaker, that sometimes the minister says, I feel we should have a law on a particular thing. And his staff does the best, his or her staff does the best they can to come up with a schema that works for what the minister has in mind. very often you get to the Chief Parliamentary Counsel's office and they say, AG, please advise your colleagues that we need more information. It's been happening over all the years, and it has happened in our case as well. We need more information. You can't just tell us you want a new law on chairs. You got to explain what you mean exactly and how you want the law to go and what you want it to say. So with the law review process, it does two things. When we pass a law, we tend to pass it and forget it. And we will only be looking to make changes to it when enough people call and complain, or when we find ourselves in an awkward or an embarrassing position because I don't do what we're supposed to do. But we tend to pass it, and then it's there, and that's it. Law review stops that from happening. It keeps it constantly under review so that it remains relevant and continues to serve the purposes in a changing Barbadian landscape. So, Mr. Speaker, we are contemplating having, given that hopefully adequate description of what law review is all about, we are contemplating then, Mr. Speaker, establishing by statute the office, I call it law review, sir, in the statute it's actually being called the Law Reform Commission. And this statute in section 29, will be establishing a law revision commission which shall be made up of a chairman and other persons suitably qualified to be law reform commissioners. The law reform commissioner under this act will be a person who holds or has held high judicial office, or a person who is an experienced legal practitioner or an experienced teacher of law in a university. That allows us, sir, to cover a whole realm, a whole raft of possibilities, but the importance is here the experience. The Law Reform Commissioner shall be appointed for a period not exceeding 5 years, and it will be on such terms and conditions, including compensation, as may be determined by the Attorney General at the time of his appointment. The Law Reform Commission shall be provided with such staff as is required for carrying out the functions. And these functions are set out in clause 31 of the bill. And I'm not going to read them all, sir. I think I've trespassed too much on this Honourable Chamber's time in introducing this bill. But it says the Law Reform Commission shall have the following powers: to receive and consider any suggestions or formal proposals for the reform of the law which may be made to the Commission. So, BIBA will be able to write to the Commission or otherwise and say, dear Commission, the laws relating to foundations have gone through so many changes in the last few years since our foundation legislation was passed, and we would like to recommend that you consider making these changes. The further powers shall be to prepare and submit to the Attorney General from time to time programs for the examination of different branches of the law with a view to reform, including recommendations as to whether such examinations should be carried out by the Commission or by some other body. So the Commission doesn't have to do it on its own. Other individuals can do it. So, for example, the Honourable Prime Minister has been engaged in a series of extensive consultations on the matter of the town planning legislation. So it is quite possible for the Commission to say, well, we don't have in-house the skills to do this, but we would like to think that on a matter dealing with banking, that the Central Bank and the Financial Services Commission, I know somebody can say about the Financial Services Commission doesn't regulate central banks. That's not the issue. It doesn't regulate banks. That's not the issue. The point is you look for people with the requisite skills, however you find them, wherever you find them, and get them to weigh in on that process of law reform. The further powers include to undertake, pursuant to any recommendations approved by the Attorney General, the examination of particular branches of the law and the formulation of proposals for reform. That's what they'll be doing, formulating proposals for reform. It goes on, sir. to provide at the instance of the Attorney General advice and information to ministries and departments of the government and other authorities which are concerned with proposals for the amendment or reform of any branch of law. And finally, to obtain such information as to the laws and legal systems of other countries as appears to the Commission likely to facilitate the performance of any of its functions. And there we have it, sir. These are two areas that are not sexy in the parliamentary agenda. They're not things that I suppose any member of parliament will run to his constituency on Sunday and say, oh, we just passed a law reform act. I'm sure not, sir. But there are a lot of things that happen in a vehicle. You will only notice how nice the vehicle look, you know. You will notice how nice it look, how low the engine sound. But there's probably a little bolt somewhere in there that if it fall off, the vehicle cannot move. Cannot move, sir. This legislation that we are bringing today is very much like that little bolt. It's a bolt, sir. And it's that little bolt that we need. We haven't had it before. But we can function with far greater efficiency and far greater timeliness by putting these two entities on a statutory footing. So, law revision and law reform, not likely to excite any of us. I don't even anticipate any kind of agitation in the debate. But the fact is that we need to put this in place. A lot of our laws are out of date. Out of date. But we simply don't have the capacity functioning the way we function to bring them all up to speed. And this will assist us, Mr. Speaker, in taking us in that direction. I look forward to the support of the opposition for this bill. I believe that it is the kind of legislation that doesn't fall into BLP or DLP or any other body. Still trying to work out the name of the leading opposition political party, sir. Huh? I hear it's also, anyway, sir, the Evangelical Labour Party, the ELP, sir. But whatever it is, this is not something that takes us into the political quarreling and things, sir. This doesn't take us there. This is something that is going to enable any administration to work effectively, because at the end of the day, the politicians in any chamber in its current configuration will consist of no more than 30 people in this house, no more than 21 in the upper house. But we do have almost 300,000 people whose interests we have to serve. And we have to serve those interests based on policy and principle and not based on politics. I'm obliged to you.
Honourable Member for St. Michael West, Leader of the Opposition.
I beg to move that this bill be read a second time, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I would like to assure the Honourable Attorney General and Member for St. Joseph that I am never here necessarily to agitate, harass, or simply to confront for confrontation's sake. And if you would permit me just but for a moment, Mr. Speaker, I would want to preface my remarks in response to what the Honourable Member of St. Joseph just presented by pausing to pay him compliments on his recent stint as acting Prime Minister, if you would allow me. I don't think in the case of Kirk, we face the most formidable threat that we've ever faced as a country, the most imminent. But of course, a threat is a threat. And it was a reality that we experienced. And I want to compliment the honourable member, if you would pause for about a second to listen, on his entire demeanor as acting Prime Minister during that episode. The calm that he exuded, the skills of communication, and the obvious discipline in leading the cabinet and the country at that time. And I genuinely express those compliments, because I sincerely feel like that. And I would add that I've heard many outside speak in the same vein. So kudos to him, Mr. Speaker. Now we're coming to the statute, the bill before us. And I don't know that I necessarily agree with the honourable member that this is not the type of topic that would generate excited debate in this chamber. I think indeed anytime we're talking about the laws of this country and what is happening with reference to the laws of this country in the wider context of justice in Barbados is a very important matter for us. And as legislators, we should be, in fact, very keen in terms of our interests and excited about any debate with reference to that. So I don't necessarily share his view. I'm going to spend a lot of time, Mr. Speaker, on a matter of law revision, as he said, because I think the more important aspect of this measure before us has to do with law reform. And that is an absolutely critical area of focus for a country at our stage of development in this post-independent time. I think when it comes to obsolescence, whether it be about the context of the law or the content of the statutes, obsolescence is not a friend of ours. Obsolescence with respect to our judicial process is not a friend of democracy. Our judicial process is a third plank of our democracy. It is extremely important that we get it right, that we be as progressive, as up-to-date, and as modern as we can be with respect to our laws. And where obsolescence is a factor, we have to treat to that. And my layman's understanding and interpretation of what we seek to do today in this House is to respond to the business of obsolescence obtaining with respect to the state of our laws in Barbados. And I think that therefore it is a good thing. That obsolescence will be detractive from the judicial process. Anything that is detractive from the judicial process is a detriment and a threat to our furthering the efforts relative to democracy in this country. Now, on the positive side, and the Attorney General did make reference to this fact, that we must ensure at all times that our laws are in such state and are relevant to the degree that they properly respond to the global dynamics which operate in this country and outside around us. Those global dynamics very much relate to commerce, as the Honourable Member for St. Joseph said, and to trade. And we've got to make sure that our laws and the state at which they are made to manifest themselves and the content of those laws are appropriate to what is happening in that global arena of trade and commerce. But I think the Honourable Member for St. Joseph expressed a rather innocent perspective of that matter. And he's right in what he said, but he's only partly fully broaching the subject, because we can understand clearly that we have to make our laws put us in a place where we are competitive in this global world. If we don't do that, we fall behind the rest of the world. Even the rest of the region leaves us behind. So that is a view which I share. But I think there's a negative aspect of this which the Honourable Member did not address, and that is the fact that global dynamics not only serve to throw up competition for us, but global dynamics are in fact used by global entities to retard our progress in this world. And when we talk, therefore, of reforming or revising our laws, it must be with a view in mind that we put ourselves always in a place where the attempts to retard our development, our growth, our progress as a small developing nation state are thwarted because we are up to speed and up to date with respect to the legislation which governs us with respect to matters not only of commerce and of trade, but other important matters as well. So we are made to conform from time to time because we want to be competitive. But the truth more fully is that we're also made to conform sometimes because the global external arena wants to introduce institutional dynamics which keep us in our place, a place where we operate on the periphery of world prosperity and world success in business and in trade. Often, there are tensions between the global conventions to which we are signatory and the sovereign expression of the will of the Barbadian government and people. That is a reality. The world does not let us have our own way often. We are brought to a place where we're made to understand and embrace the wisdom in signing on to certain conventions. But at the same time, we realize the threat to our forward movement as a nation, which come along with our being signatory to those conventions. And that tension arises when a small developing country like Barbados wants to express its sovereign will, its sovereign thrust in a certain direction, economically or otherwise, politically, socially, and the bigger world about us, because we are now signed into their institutional arrangements and their conventions, thwart and frustrate the expression of that sovereign will. So that's the other part of the story. We must see how, as a nation state, we can have our laws so reformed as to frustrate their efforts to frustrate us, if you catch my drift, Mr. Speaker. Our sovereign expression will often collide with existing global conventions to which we have signed on. That has been our experience in very recent past. That has been our experience in the more distant past. That is in relation to the international dynamics operating about us. But Mr. Speaker, there are also dynamics operating at home in our domestic space, of which we always have to be cognizant. And that is, there are always sectoral interests which are also bent on having their own way and making lawmakers subject to their will. So a group of persons having offered themselves to serve in the national interest is elected by the people. We come here to this house, and some who have the privilege of serving in cabinet lead in the exercise of formulating and developing and implementing policy decidedly formulated to carry our country forward as a whole. But there are sectoral interests whose interests do not coincide with the interests of the wider collective we call Barbados. And so the efforts of parliaments, made up like this one is, the efforts of cabinet, as well intentioned as this one is, the efforts of cabinet, the efforts of parliament can be frustrated by the power, the presence, and the will of sectoral interests. So when we shape laws, we seek to shape laws. We're seeking to form and shape laws in an environment where that dynamic is also a reality. The Honourable Attorney General made the point that we are politicians. And as politicians, we come to the table to formulate laws with the interests of our specific and immediate constituents in mind. And that is a reality. You come to the table, you bear in mind the interests that are obtained in Ellerton, you bear in mind the interests that are obtained in Spikestone, you bear in mind the interests that are obtained in Bayland, because it's the people of Bayland that sent you here. So that is an ever-present consideration in what you do. Of course, because you're a serious and a genuine lawmaker, and you know that you're operating in the interest, yes, of the people of Bayland, but in the wider interest of Barbados, because the responsibilities laid on your shoulder and the privilege you have to serve in that important context, you understand that that consideration is brought to bear upon the initiatives around law reform. And that is true, and the Honourable member made that clear. What he did not go on to say, what is also true, is that there are other considerations which are sometimes brought to the table, and it is the interest of sectoral elites and sectoral entities in jurisdictions like ours who also want to have their own way. So if they had their way, it would not be the interest of the wider Barbados to be served. It would not be the interest of the constituents of Bayland or of Bayfield to be served. It would be their narrow sectoral interest. When we come, therefore, to the business of law reform, when we come, therefore, to the business of making laws, these are also considerations which are brought to the table and which must be considered. And these interests express themselves in widely varying contexts. And it can range from the multi-million-dollar hotel investment or some other such investment, and it can go as far down the economic ladder as vending in Bridgetown or on the highways of Barbados. And sectoral interests peddle their will to the detriment of small people. Sectoral, you know this very well, Mr. Speaker, you're a grassroots man, if I might say that in here. I do honor your position. But you know that sectoral interests peddle their will powerfully in jurisdictions like Barbados and want to know that the outflow of law formulation is such that those interests are served at the expense often of smaller, more minute or minor interests in the wider Barbadian. So vendors are made to hustle while other persons get large tax concessions because there are institutional investors which are geared towards spurring economic development in the Barbados context. These things also are brought to the table when it comes to the business of law reform. So there's a challenge to the state, and the challenge to state reforms, the challenge to law reforms, which are more designed to bring progress to the interests of the state. And those challenges are twofold. We've been trying to say globalization, internationalization. The international regulatory environment is made to be such that we have to find our narrow space and fit therein if we are to benefit from the crumbs offered at the table of the world's larger financial and trading institutions. The international order often determines, therefore, the positions we take on matters of importance to us. Recently, this chamber passed some legislation with respect to changes to the Offences Against the Persons Act, occasionally changing the Constitution. That is a result of what has happened around us regionally. That is a result of what has happened around us internationally. And though we have no quarrel with that because it's a move in the right direction, often what we are asked to do is not necessarily a move in the right direction as seen from our perspective. But we're asked to do that and sometimes forced to do that, because if we don't do that, then our interests are at risk. Things like legalization of the use of marijuana. This is now something that is occupying the attention of the international world. And legislation in various jurisdictions is being changed to accommodate that. I have no doubt that pretty soon, in fact, I think the government has already said that at some point in time we have to address this matter of legalizing the use of marijuana for medical purposes, might I dare add, because that is what I've heard today. I'm not criticizing any policy disposition. I'm simply saying, as it stands right now, the international dynamics, the international order determines the position we take on various policy issues. Gay rights is another very major issue in contention in the world around us, and the world not very far from us either. And at some point in time, I imagine, Barbados will have to make a more frontal address of that issue. I'm not speaking to any particular policy disposition here. I'm simply saying that the international order tends to determine our positions, and then our positions become enshrined in law. So this debate before us is absolutely critical and is absolutely important. But the international order, Mr. Speaker, you would know, is subject itself to the influence of entities that are not states, but institutions, corporations, operating in that environment. So that multinational corporations influence the positions of state governments in the developed countries, and through the influence of those state governments exert influence on governments in developing countries such as ours. This is the way of the world, Mr. Speaker. That is the new dominance. And our laws, in my humble view, must reflect our response to that new attempt at economic dominance, at socio-political dominance, because it is real. There are institutions of this world that facilitate us, but they're not necessarily favorable to our interests. There are institutions in this world that will aid us financially, economically, and in other ways. But these institutions do so in pursuit of their own interests. So that we live in a geopolitical world where the US, because of its dominance, may exert power and influence in Barbados or the wider Caribbean, where other developed countries can do that. But the point I'm making, Mr. Speaker, is that there are institutions and corporations in these countries that exert power on their states to formulate and lead in the effort of formulating international conventions to which then we later find ourselves bound. Just to illustrate, water is an extremely critical, valuable resource. It is one without which we cannot do. Now we understand these things and we see these things very readily, Mr. Speaker. If we start to talk about energy, we know that there are major oil companies operating in developed countries that exert their will upon their states, their sovereign states. And their sovereign states then find a way of expressing their will, the will of their institutions upon developing countries such as ours. We can understand that by reference to oil. What we don't so easily seem to see is that water is a very valuable resource. One of the ways to really exert influence in the Barbadian context, one of the ways to really make money in the Barbadian context on the part of an international corporation is by means of using its influence over international institutions to make economies like ours subject to their will. We know today that our water resources are supplied by the efforts of the state. The Barbados Water Authority is a state-owned, state-related entity corporation. We are now, as I can see or hear, understand, beginning to consider that we need to make institutions like this subject to the governance of private entities to a larger extent than it already is. I am simply saying we have got to guard against a situation where our valuable resources fall under the over-influence of private sector interess, especially where those private sector interests are institutionally, internationally based. And I hope to make myself clear. Sometimes I confuse myself, Mr. Speaker. But all I'm saying is, when we shape laws, we're shaping laws in a certain environment. And part of the dynamic, part of the mix in that environment is that sovereign states in the developed world are influenced by multilateral and international corporations in those state contexts, which then through their states exert pressure and will on states like ours. And before we know it, we have made ourselves vulnerable and subject to new forms of exploitation, the likes of which we thought we had left behind when we became independent and removed the colonial shackles. Yeah? And that's what I'm talking about. And if we miss those points in these days, we stand in peril of losing a lot of what we had gained. And what we say with reference to water can be said with reference to other areas upon which we are highly dependent. We have got to watch very carefully what happens to ownership structures in this country. We have got to make sure that our laws, when formulated, take all of these considerations on board. We want to be doing more to democratize ownership structures in Barbados. We do not want to be, in this day, doing less than we are now doing. And rather than democratize ownership structures in Barbados, make the position even more liberal, such that local private interests, to the detriment of the wider national interests, or outside international interests, become more entrenched with respect to ownership of resources in Barbados. I believe democracy is a very important thing. I started by saying this business of revision and law reform has a lot to do with that third plank of our democracy, and part of the push, the thrust going forward in terms of furthering our democracy is ensuring that there's a wider, more universalized quality or type of economic democracy in Barbados, and part of that responsibility that we have before us is to democratize the structures of ownership. So let's be very careful. Let's be very careful that our situation of need right now, as exists, financial and economic need in Barbados, our problems with debt and deficit and all of these things, let's be very careful that this does not bring us to the point where we make ourselves overly subject to influences such that rather than democratize further ownership structures in Barbados, we make them more entrenched and narrow to the detriment of the Barbadian public. And so these entities will do that, Mr. Speaker. They will seek to keep us in our place, so to speak, by threat of relocation. So they come, they enjoy the sweets for a while, and we want to shape laws to go in a certain direction, and the pressure they bring to bear is a threat of relocation. But if you do that, we have to go. If you do that, we have to pull up sticks and go. We feel we can't let them go, because that's implications for employment, that has implications for foreign exchange, that has implications for institutional development. So we can't we cannot allow them to relocate. And so rather than push forward and reform our laws in that progressive direction as we anticipated, we pull back because we collide with interests which are at odds with ours. Power of dictation based on competition, the Honourable Attorney General referred to that. We feel in the face of competition, we have to do certain things. The effect on employment, the effect on institutional development, etc. And they come with a tremendous capacity to flout our labor laws. And I don't want to sit down without mentioning this point, because I heard the General Secretary of Barbados Workers Union recently making it clear to the Honourable Member for St. Peter that he has to be a bit more energetic about doing something with respect to certain companies in Barbados which are flouting our labor laws and our labor regulation culture. I say that not to attack the Honourable Member of St. Peter. I will never do that on a Tuesday. But I say that to just point and to illustrate a reality. And that is what she said. We have certain companies whose names I will not call that feel that they can do as they like in Barbados, and that all labor laws don't matter. Well, these are the things you run up against when you talk about law reform and all the rest. Mr. Speaker, there's a constant need to examine the appropriateness, therefore, of our judicial legal framework. When you consider what our socio-economic trusts are, when you consider what our economic orientation is, we have to make sure that our laws appropriately match that, despite all that is happening around us. Our laws should reflect and respond to this. I want to touch a bit on technology and its use as a major dynamic in development of law and dispense of justice. The Honourable Member spoke to that, and that is critical. We live in the vortex of a tech culture today, impacts on everything else. If we're going to strengthen our institutional justice processes, we've got to incorporate the use of technology. If we're going to build capacity, we have to incorporate the use of technology. And if we're going to provide better access to public information, then we have to incorporate the use of technology. I think the judicial sector is one of the sectors in Barbados which is most evidently behind in terms of incorporating the use of technology. Our people must have critical access to justice. We must provide for greater efficiencies in the system. We must make sure that the laws that are presented to the public for consumption by whomever are relevant, are in a state where they are considered relevant. You don't want to have the Honourable Member for St. James North having to make recourse. They tell me this color is blue, to a blue book that is up to date and carries content which is obsolescent and certainly out of step with where the reality is. So we really have to embrace the technology. I think, Mr. Speaker, as well, we've got to consider, if we talk about law reform, more meaningful legislation, more potent legislation to regulate the use of social media. People in Barbados are every day defamed by means of social media. I dread the day when my day comes, but I believe inevitably it will. And I'm sure Mr. Honourable Member St. James North equally dreads that day, and so do you, Mr. Speaker, because I have not yet seen you defamed in any way on the social media, nor have I seen the Honourable Member St. James North. I'm not quite sure what the position is with the Honourable Member for St. George North, but certainly I have not seen, and that is something, that's a reality with which we have to deal, and defamation laws must be made appropriately applicable to the new tech environment. Else people will say what they will about people, damage their reputation, destroy their families, interfere with their career progress, and all kinds of stuff. Incite violence, Mr. Speaker, against your person. We have to make sure that the laws which govern defamation are more appropriately applicable to this situation. Now, Mr. Speaker, there was recently, I think last year, a conference in the Bahamas of Commonwealth law ministers at the end of last year, and there were some considerations which they considered to be important, which I am sure the government of Barbados has been concerning itself with or will concern itself with. They made reference to the lack of appropriately potent and relevant legislation to be applied to situations of disaster, emergency response issues in the Caribbean. We have had Dominica last year, serious stress. We have had Grenada in a more distant past. We have had Haiti, and those stories are almost legend, especially post the earthquake of 2012, where issues arose in that emergency situation which were not quite properly captured by existing law and the legislative frameworks. And this conference of last year in the Bahamas concerned itself by identifying that as an area of law to which we must treat and build out and formalize the legal framework to be applied in those extraterritorial and regional post-disaster collaboration. So when the police of Barbados or the defense force of Barbados or medical staff of Barbados have to enter into a post-disaster environment, places like Dominica or elsewhere, or if the reverse becomes the reality, then there is a sufficiently relevant legislative framework that can treat to what needs to be done in those situations. That these things revolve around matters like customs clearance and policing issues and reconstruction issues and legal status issues and money movement issues. All those realities confronted those who were involved in the effort in the most recent disaster of last year in Dominica. God forbid that we ever faced with such a reality. But if we are, then our legislative architecture should be made such as that it can help to respond to situations arising out of that kind of context. Then the Honourable Member mentioned the matter of cyber crime. And the cross-border nature of crime today is very properly known to us. And crime it's multifaceted, it's multidimensional. There's the normal financial and economic situation, then there's a terrorist-related situation. And all of these aspects of crime manifest themselves by reference to the cyber world and the use of technology. And therefore, in an effort to counter that, we've got to make sure that we have the proper legislation in place so that the techno-related crime could be properly addressed. So it's not only a matter of incorporating the use of technology in the dispensation of justice and the various processes related to our justice system, but it is also the matter of providing the type of legislation that can help us to better counter cybercrime. And that is a reality. Systems and their functions are disrupted. I think I recall an incident of earlier this year, or was it late last year, when one merchant complained that his systems were hacked and lost an entire day of business as a result of systems being down. There are financial losses associated with that. There's a threat to security relative to documents because people's systems are hacked into, documents are copied or replaced or transferred. And then the business, very important, Mr. Speaker, of electoral fraud. We've got to be concerned about that in Barbados. We cannot say this is something that relates to jurisdictions outside of our geography or even jurisdictions in the near region, but these are realities with which we have to deal. And the electoral process, the techno facilities can be used as recently became a major issue, still is a major issue in the United States with respect to manipulation of the electoral environment and even to the point of perpetrating of electoral fraud. Now, we don't want that to become our reality here. If I may, with your permission, Mr. Speaker, quote from this document. This is, I think the Honourable Attorney General referred to one of these reports that came out of the UK Law Commission. And the Honourable gentleman from St. Joseph, this is a report on the 13th program of law reform in the UK, England, Wales. And this speaks to the issue of use of electronic documents and the call for the legislation to be modernized such that it addresses this kind of a problem. If I may briefly quote, Most modern businesses, Mr. Speaker, have embraced technology to conduct transactions online and electronically. However, there's no case law or legislation setting out explicitly that documents executed with an electronic signature and which may exist solely in electronic form satisfy statutory requirements for documents to be in writing and or signed on the hand. For example, the Electronic Communications Act 2000 deals with the admissibility into evidence, but not the intrinsic validity of electronic signatures. I'm sure this is not news to you, Mr. Speaker. I'm just reading this for the benefit of the Honourable Member for St. George and the Honourable Member for St. Lucie, my friends. But I'm sure this is not new to you. Stakeholders have told the Law Commission that in the absence of clear authority, the question of the validity of such documents remains open to doubt and uncertainty. Still it appears that there are particular concerns around the electronic signature and how that is witnessed. We've been told that the uncertainty around electronic signatures and witnessing is preventing some UK businesses from moving towards fully electronic transactions, which could be faster and more efficient. And I'm sure you knew that, and I'm sure if ever a case arises under your professional duty call at the courts of Barbados in relation to this matter, you will make very much reference and clear reference to this. Then there's something called dematerialization and intermediated securities. I'll just quote this very quickly, Mr. Speaker. Shares and bonds are increasingly held, we know about bonds in Barbados. Shares and bonds are increasingly held through a system of dematerialization and intermediation. In other words, paper certificates have now been replaced by a system in which most investors own securities in the form of computerized credit entries through a chain of what is called intermediaries. These are brokers and banks. Such relationships may be extremely complex with multiple layers of intermediaries. The call is for the type of legislation that addresses this type of phenomenon in the world in which we now exist. One last few lines. The system of intermediated shareholdings has made securities trading significantly quicker, cheaper, more convenient. However, there are potential problems with the current system. For example, the ultimate investors of intermediated securities may be deprived of remedies they would have had against the issuer of the shares if they had held the securities directly, because they've had no direct relationship. Even where ultimate investors suffer loss due to the negligent or even fraudulent actions of the issuer on the intermediary further up the chain, they may have no. In other words, Mr. Speaker, because you're using this technical medium with relation to the matter of securities and investments, there is a deficiency in the legislation that covers you in terms of your rights and that gives you recourse to remedies at court or on the law in the absence of a much more potent and a much fuller framework of legislation. And if we're going to be going, as the Honourable Member for St. Joseph suggested, if we're going to be participating fully in a global world where these things obtain, if we're going to be going after investments such as we need to do now, we have to provide the platforms that allow for this type of investment and make sure that people's interests are covered under the law and by the architecture that we have put in place. Now, Mr. Speaker, I want to conclude perhaps. I don't want to make much of this, but I want to raise it because I don't necessarily fully appreciate what is intended here. But the Honourable Attorney General made reference to the Law Reform Commission. I made reference to Section 29, and he did tell us that the Law Reform Commission will be made up of a number of persons, and perhaps the section makes, and the section in fact does make reference to how they are appointed, and so forth and so forth. But he made reference to this in a context of wanting to distance the political influence and political directorate from the formation and reform of laws in Barbados. And he illustrated this by making reference to a number of politicians in the context of their constituencies, and the fact that if you put in place a law reform commission, then you distance the reform of the laws and the thrust in that direction from the influence of the political process, and that commission then becomes an advisory mechanism to the legislature, so to speak. But that, I understand and appreciate that, but there's some who will question why then, therefore, are the commissioners to be appointed by the Attorney General? And that's my understanding of it, and that's Section 29 and Clause 2. Why then, if that is the case, why are the commissioners, or is the commission to be appointed by the fiat of the office, or by the Attorney General? And then number 7, and perhaps some clarity can be given to that. I understand that the appointment of a judge to be a member of this commission does not affect the judge's tenure, time of service, and privileges relating to that. My understanding is that a judge would be appointed as a member of this commission, but that appointment is post his tenure, his formal tenure of serving on the bench. Because I can't imagine that you will be appointing a serving judge, a judge who is currently serving on the bench, to this role. And my understanding is that this would be somebody who, having served on the bench, still qualified in terms of age and otherwise to serve on the bench, but who's chosen to do this role. The tenure continues, but the role on the bench, I believe, comes to an end, but that can be clarified. These are the few concerns, few thoughts, what concerns, few thoughts, Mr. Speaker, that I would want to put before the House as part of the contribution to this debate. And I thank you.
Now member for St. James North.
Mr. Speaker, I do not plan for my intervention in this debate to be full discourse of the time for which I would have, but just to give a few thoughts in support of what the Honourable Attorney General said this morning in introducing the bill. This bill is a very significant bill. The new Barbados Labour Party government has, of course, from day one been preoccupied to a large extent in trying to stabilize the economy of this country, our macroeconomic scheme of things in terms of taking over a government that was effectively bankrupt and insolvent, and in negotiating arrangements with the International Monetary Fund and with other international agencies of which we are a member of. We've been involved, of course, in terms of mission-critical aspects of our society and our economy, 15 outlined, tackling all of them within these first 4 or 5 months of the governance of our country. But equally of equal importance in any society is the legal system of a country and the rule of law, and how the law is used as a tool for social engineering and to bring progress, development, and advancement at all levels to the people of society, especially those who are most disadvantaged in terms of their socio and economic well-being. And it is within that context and vortex in which this bill is being debated before your Parliament today, sir. The law has always to be just. Everyone has to have equal rights before the law, no matter of their circumstances, the matter in terms of the poverty, and the matter in terms of whether they are fully able in terms of their mental and physical capacities or otherwise. And this bill is seeking to advance that cause within the context of our country. The explanatory memorandum, in fact, of the bill summarizes it by saying that the purpose of this bill is to repeal and replace the Law Revision Act, which in fact is the second chapter of the laws of Barbados, right after the Constitution, which, as we all know, is the supreme law of the country. It seeks to modernize the system of revising and consolidating and editing the laws of Barbados. And the explanatory note goes on to say this is necessary to make the system compatible with the technological environment in which the laws are now being produced and managed. The changes will also increase the flexibility and bring improvements in relation to the speed and efficiency of the system. This bill would also facilitate the publication of laws on the internet or in an electronic format such as CD. That's the revision part of the bill, sir. In terms of now the reform part of the bill, which, as the Honourable Attorney General pointed out, is in fact the most significant and more far-reaching part of this bill. The bill makes provision for the establishment of an official law reform commission, which will make it possible for the laws to be reviewed, reformed on a systematic basis for the first time. And the commission will be required to prepare a law reform program on an annual basis and provide law reform reports of their research findings and recommendations for submission to Parliament and for the use of the public. What we are doing today, sir, in fact, should have been done many years before. I have said in the last Parliament, when I was first elected to these honourable chambers, that this was something which was of prime importance and which the last government ought to have brought in fulfillment of their manifesto promise of 2013. They promised, sir, at page 53 of their 2013 manifesto that it was their view that a law reform commission suitably structured and provided with adequate resources could perform an important function by ensuring that the legal system provides a framework that enables our society to manage contemporary challenges and effectively. And they went on to say how it would be comprised and composed and the duties of it and how it would implement its policies. Of course, not one word about any law reform commission was stated in this Parliament by any member of Cabinet or by the Prime Minister or the then Attorney General, none whatsoever on law reform. Again, wasted opportunity, lost 10 years by an absolutely inept government, of which thankfully we were rid of in no uncertain proportions on the 24th of May this year. Would not have cost a big set of money, sir, because they always spoke about issues within the context of money they couldn't bring in. They couldn't pass an anti-corruption or integrity in public life act because, according to the then Attorney General, it would have cost money and he had other priorities within his ministry, but yet they found money to appoint a 450-member constituency councils all across all the 30 constituencies in Barbados. Question of priorities, sir, of how you distribute the, yes, limited financial resources that are available to a government of Barbados in these times. And this certainly, one has to give credit to the Honourable Prime Minister, Honourable Attorney General, and of course the my fellow members of cabinet for agreeing to bring this bill and determining that we should bring into force a law revision commission and commissioners and staff, as well as a law reform commission and staff, and adequately resource it in terms of technology, equipment, and all of that. Yes, you know, a lot of people and attorneys at law too, of course, as you well know, sir, being a prominent criminal attorney at law, like to have the hard copy laws of Barbados in the hand or when they go to court. But the issue is that this comes at a price. When I first became a member of parliament, yes, I was told and I obtained a copy of all the volumes of Barbados, these blue books. I think there are 3 sets here on the floor of this chambers now, but they cost a lot of money. I believe I was told they cost about $8,000 to produce. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition, I think, was saying he does have one, but surely he would have had one in his first stint in Parliament. Never had? Okay. They're costly, sir, $8,000 a person. And I know I was told that they run out of them because they didn't have money under the last administration to continue to produce them. So provision is being made in this bill, and when it becomes the laws of Barbados, for all the laws to be consolidated and produced in electronic form. And that's the way, of course, the world is moving. That's the way our government and administration has to go in terms of cost effectiveness, cost efficiency, and as well of being able to disseminate on a wider basis, because virtually everyone has access to the internet, the computer, equipment, tablets, cell phones, everything on your cell phone device as well. And virtually every person, including some of the youngest children, have cell phones or access to them. So this is now Barbados moving into the third decade of the 21st century in terms of law revision and dissemination and publication of the laws of Barbados. As has been said earlier, you know, you have these laws, and in fact the bill speaks about existing cumulative editions in the case of statutes being the 1971 revised edition of the Statutes of Barbados. And you would know, sir, that was the last time. In fact, the blue books in here speak about laws of Barbados 1971 to 2008. And it speaks of, in the case of subsidiary legislation, being the 1978 revised edition of subsidiary legislation. But then you have problems, as we know, especially in the legal profession, of obtaining now the updates to laws. Because as the Honourable Attorney General said, you then have to now make sure you are current on any legislation, that you don't go in a court or wherever you have to and quote law that has been amended, law that has been abolished. And therefore, this process that we are doing today is to make that a reality, that it will be more easier to find the up-to-date law at a particular time by way of constant revision of these laws, by way of corrections to them through the Law Revision Commission, by way of production of the laws on the internet in terms of e-governance, etc., so that everyone would have access to the most up-to-date laws of Barbados. Because as the old adage says, sir, ignorance of the law is no excuse. And if that is to hold prime today, and if a government is to facilitate that adage being reality and to give the citizen the opportunity to know, we have to assist, and that is what we are doing in terms of this legislative reform here today. As you would know, sir, as well as anyone else, the Constitution of Barbados my colleague, the Honourable Member for Christchurch South, one of the most eminent attorneys at law in the Eastern Caribbean, called for the Constitution from me, and I'm sure that when he makes his contribution, as I expect he would later today on this bill, he would probably quote constitutional sections as well. Section 26, of course, saving clause, contained in all, I believe, the constitutions of the ex-colonies, newly independent countries in Barbados in the 1960s. I mean, Guyana, of course, has reformed and brought in a republic constitution, as well as Dominica. But our constitution at section 26 still has, as one of the entrenched clauses, the fact that any law which was passed or which was law before independence will not be deemed to be inconsistent with the Constitution just because it was passed before independence. And of course, we know that we still have some laws to that effect. The juvenile justice, the legislation which creates the regime of juvenile justice in Barbados, for instance, as we know, is almost 100 years old. And as I said already in this session of Parliament, we intend to bring in new legislation within the foreseeable future, certainly next year, on this issue to change that. So, you know, that in itself is an issue, that you have this savings clause, but yet we have moved on in life over the last half century or more. And therefore you need commissioners such as what are being created today to keep the law abreast in terms of our societal developments, because law must always, if it is to be relevant to the people and to serve the interests of the people, has to take into account the present mores of a society in terms of not only its society and economy, but in terms of religion, in terms of culture, in terms of human rights. It must be cognizant of the investment climate of a country. Of course, it must keep abreast of developments in terms of computer use, misuse, and this is developing virtually every year, 2 years. I mean, what, 60 years ago, I believe someone said that if the world would have 7 computers, one day it would have sufficient computers. We have come far away from that, and the law in terms of computer misuse and proper use of computers, all of this is tied into this development. And the evolution of human rights, the evolution of integrity and conduct of public officers in their public life, all of that has to be looked at on a continuous basis. Because we in Barbados, as the Honourable Attorney General said, we might feel that we are God's gift to the world. A lot of Barbadians do, but the reality is that we are a small dot in a huge global world. And we have to be cognizant of the reality of the world and the trends in the world. There are some issues, yes, that we would stand firm on in terms of our principles, in terms of what we regard as traditional Barbadians ethos, which is not on the table for discussion. But the reality is that we live in a world, and that we as a people have to, in some cases, go along with the trends of the world. Section 12 of the Act, sir, in fact is, again, a significant part of the Act. It speaks towards revision of fees and fines, because, again, we know the world has evolved. I mean, the then Prime Minister in the last session of Parliament ridiculously said, and he knew that it was ridiculous, because I would fail to believe he did not know that it was ridiculous and that he believed his own propaganda. He spoke about the present Prevention of Corruption Act, which was passed in 1929 in pre-independence Parliament of Barbados, based fully on the 1917 Anti-Corruption Prevention of Corruption Act in England. In other words, 100 years old. He said it was adequate for Barbados today. He knew well that his propaganda could only go as far as him. Certainly couldn't go to any sensible Barbadian, because the fine under that act is $2,400 maximum, you know, because that would have been sufficient 100 years ago, but certainly is not today. So Section 12 of this bill before your Parliament today, sir, speaks about where a fee or fine is prescribed in an enactment, and the Law Revision Commissioner is of the view that the fee or fine requires revising due to the passage of time. The Commissioner shall advise the relevant ministry in writing that the fee or fine, as the case may be, should be revised. And this is an extremely important issue, to bring the law, to bring penalties under our respective laws within the context of the modern day, and to make them relevant and appropriate to the cause which we serve in this country. The more significant part, though, as I said earlier, of this bill, though, is the reform aspect of it, because we need a commission, a body, an agency, to be constantly looking at our laws to see how they need to be reformed, how they need to be updated. As we said, the law is evolutionary. It cannot be static, and therefore I certainly applaud the intention of this government to bring into being a law reform commissioner and supporting staff to assist in this regard, because yes, the ministries that we have as cabinet members are not able to fulfill this task fully, so you need a group of experts. The commission is to be headed by, as has been said, by both the Honourable Attorney General and the Honourable Leader of the Opposition, by someone of judicial stature, someone who has held judicial office or holds judicial office, an experienced legal practitioner, experienced teacher in the law at university. And this experience and training will come to bear in giving advice to the Honourable Attorney General and by extension the government and people of Barbados on reform of law on a consistent basis. This commission, of course, would be able to tap into the experience and resources that other similar commissions established in the Caribbean and in small developing states of similar nature to Barbados and of other Commonwealth countries have had. As the Honourable Attorney General said, some states, some countries in the Caribbean have such commissions already, Bahamas, Trinidad, and we will be able to obtain their technical advice, their support, because we will not be reinventing the wheel. I mean, it is always foolish to attempt to reinvent the wheel, and we will be able to gain from their experiences and learn from whatever mistakes those countries and other countries with law reform commissions may have made in the past. Of course, there's the Commonwealth Secretariat, which will be there to give overriding advice, and of course we're a member of that Secretariat as well. So, Mr. Speaker, I certainly wish to associate myself with this bill before Parliament today. The bill, there will also be provision, of course, for input from the public in terms of what laws ought to be revised. The chairman of the Law Reform Commission would be legislatively mandated to, at the beginning of each year, submit a program for law reform, not later than the 31st of January that year, to the Attorney General outlining the program. And of course, the reports of what the Commission, the Law Reform Commission, has done each calendar year would be submitted to the Attorney General for laying in Parliament. So, of course, it will be a public document in terms of the functions and what the Law Reform Commission has been able to achieve and look at within the preceding year. Will be a document of the House and therefore open to all the public to see. Because clearly freedom of information has to be part of the process going forward of the government of Barbados within the context of law and of course subject to issues of national security. And this is the way that this government has been going. We, as you well know, sir, there's presently the Select Committee of this Parliament looking into the Integrity and Public Life Bill, which is before your Parliament, so that we can tighten the issues on it, which may need tightening with the input of the public. And certainly we intend to bring greater democratic participation in terms of informing on our legal reform, which has to be one of the foundations of the advancement of the just society of Barbados. I thank you, sir.
Honourable member for St. Michael's South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, sir. I rise to support this bill on law reform and law enforcement. Sir, the Honourable AG closed by saying that many pieces of legislation are out of date and in need of reform. And we came into office, sir, with a promise that we were going to make the government fit for a purpose. In fact, the Honourable Prime Minister says that in pretty much every speech that she gives in relation to that which we are supposed to be doing as a government for this country. I believe now more than ever, sir, that the duty is ours to bring Barbados into the modern era, both in terms of our policies and our programming, but certainly as well in relation to our legislation. And sir, there are a number of new things that are on the table for this government. The Honourable Member for St. Michael East has a responsibility for making Barbados go green. And you will hear him speaking very soon about the new things we have to do for garbage collection and garbage separation and so on, as a government that has to be fit for purpose. And we would have to bring legislation here to make that a reality. My good friend, the Honourable Member for St. Philip West, has a responsibility for making Barbados go orange as well. And the new things that we will do in the cultural industries. As a matter of fact, the Honourable Member is always saying that we need to start seeing culture as a business and to make better use of what we have. I have, sir, responsibility for making Barbados go blue. And in that regard, I will be bringing some legislation here on a number of things that are related to the development of the blue economy. The Honourable Member for St. Lucie is saying that we go red, but in this regard, sir, we go blue. But we have to bring Barbados into the modern era and bring about sustainable changes that make sense and speak to the legislation that is relevant, sir, for this time. But nothing is static. And so even if we change the legislation now to reflect who we are as a country and the values that drive us as a people, there will always be a time that we have to go back and review and perhaps refresh and amend the legislations. But we are discussing these new things, sir, as a government. And there will be a lot of conversation in here about the amount of legislation that we've brought. As a matter of fact, Mr. Speaker, sir, I believe in the last 4 or 5 months we've brought more legislation to this Parliament than the other side did in 10 years. And it is in our interest that when we bring this legislation, that as a government we set in place and train a system that will review and perhaps reflect upon the legislation that we have brought so that our legislation remains relevant over time. And so what we have, as you would well know, perhaps more than most in this chamber, sir, is a lot of legislation that is outdated, antiquated, irrelevant, not fit for purpose. And we have a duty, sir, to make that right. As you know, sir, most of my life, the last time I said this, you corrected me, so I'm going to be very cautious. Most of my life I spent as an employee in a government organization, a public servant. And like you, sir, I had the opportunity to be manager of the Child Care Board. And I know, sir, you also had the opportunity to be manager of the Child Care Board. And the Honourable Member for St. Thomas, who now has responsibility for child care, will tell you that a lot of the laws pertaining to child care is old, irrelevant, not fit for purpose. And then I became Director of Policy and studied the larger social sector. The same thing. A lot of our legislation is old, outdated, not fit for purpose. And we need to change all of these things. And the Honourable AG this morning said that we have, sir, to have law revision. And in law revision, he spoke to allowing for a process where the statutes are always under review. And the inconsistencies in the language would have to be addressed. And in some cases, there must be corrections to omissions that render the law unclear. And for those of us who are now new to Parliament and is in the process of trying to bring legislation, that back and forth between the CPC and who we are as a ministry takes a long time. Doing that exact same thing, looking at the language, and it makes a very big difference. And so it is important that as part of what we do, we bring forward, sir, the issue of law revision. But words matter. I recently made a post on my Facebook page where I said, I will work with the people of the Bayland until the bitter end. And as God is my judge, I dare till the bitter end. But some man on Facebook then determined that the bitter end was the wrong language. And proceeded then to engage in a whole conversation with himself about what that meant. But words matter. And we have to be very careful about what we say in our words. And I believe, sir, you would know that in law, perhaps more so than in any other profession, the words matter. And so it is very important that we get that right as a government, what it is that we are saying and what it is that we mean and why it is important. It is very important to do this and to get it right. I have been, as a public servant in a government agency, very frustrated in many times, trying to do something, but the laws don't allow you to do them. You can't make certain adjustments because the laws say something else. relevant to a time that is past, not relevant to that which we are doing now. I had the opportunity as well, sir, to work in an international agency. And I had the benefit of seeing how it is done, perhaps on the world stage. And we cannot have global aspirations and hinder ourselves with these things that are more, I believe, more faithful to tradition than to common sense, or to that which is right. And in this international agency that I worked, I saw that all the legislation was available online. And you could also get almost in real time explanations to what pieces of the legislation meant. So when I say, and when we say as a government that we are going to do this and go online, it is because that is not what is expected of a country that has global aspirations and must rise above the idea that it is bound to these traditions that no longer serve us, that no longer make this government fit for purpose. And I believe that these are things that we must do, sir. We are now at that point in our development, Mr. Speaker, sir. And so these are the kind of conversations that we must have. The Honourable Attorney General made the point, Mr. Speaker, sir, that size must not be the determinant, and that just because we are small, it doesn't mean that we can be less comprehensive in comparison to countries that are bigger than we are. We have the same issues. We have to deal with the same realities. As a matter of fact, there are some cases where we have to be even more cautious, because small island developing states such as ours often are battered by these larger countries and these larger states, oftentimes. And so we have to be even more careful. And that is why I am very supportive of this legislation, because I believe that as we do the necessary amendments and we continue to monitor the laws, that we will do so in ways that are advantageous to that which is Barbadian. I really do. However, the Honourable Leader of the Opposition, and I listened to him very carefully, the Honourable Leader of the Opposition spoke about the potential for vested interests or for the elite to be able to influence who we are and try to push their own agenda. And I believe that the Honourable Attorney General was very clear in his delivery when he said that even though we have to look at what is happening on the world stage, we cannot import in a wholesale fashion that which is happening on the world stage. And that which defines the Barbadian way must be distinctly Barbadian. And that there is hardly a risk from what we are doing here today. To give expression to the fears raised by the Honourable Leader of the Opposition, I believe that the Honourable Attorney General, when he said that we could not import in a wholesale fashion, spoke to the reality of that which is before us. We have to be global and we have to be local at the same time. Or everybody who is alive in 2018 and trying to manage a business, that is the reality with which they're faced. You have to operate in a global environment, because we cannot separate ourselves from that reality no matter how much you talk about it. We can't delink. The world is now an interrelated place. It is a highway, a village. And we cannot separate ourselves from it. The Honourable Attorney General also spoke very clearly about why we need to do this. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition also made some point about the multinational corporations that may exert pressure on states like ours that are vulnerable and subject to new forms of exploitation. Well, that is a reality for anybody. But this piece of legislation does not give rise to that. It doesn't. And we could get in any debate or in any conversation and talk about all these things and play to that part of our imagination that is creative. But the reality is that this legislation does not give rise to that. We brought before this Honourable House a set of legislation, sir, that speaks to the need for us to be constantly reinventing and reforming the legislation that we bring, monitoring it to make sure that it is relevant. The Honourable Attorney General, though he didn't like the phrase, he said that we have to have a way to feed into government so that ministers are not the ones solely responsible for bringing legislation, but that we have a body that is taking a look, almost a holistic look at the entire country, the world, looking at the direction of the world and informing the ministries and the ministers about the way they should go. Now, what is the harm in somebody taking that kind of a panoramic view? Being fed the information on the world stage and saying, look, this is where Barbados must go. And in so doing, shaping it in a way that allows the values that drives who we are as a people to be reflected in the legislation. It is not about a wholesale importation. And it does not give rise to the fears that may abound in the minds of some, that all of a sudden Barbados will become completely ravaged by the international organization because we have a government asleep at the wheel. Well, if it didn't happen in the last 10 years when the government was asleep at the wheel, I don't see how it can happen now. And that is not the nature of this legislation. And we have, sir, to be responsible in how we project ourselves when we speak to what it is that we are doing. And Mr. Speaker, sir, the Honourable Attorney General also spoke to what I consider to be a shift in the paradigm. And as a minister responsible for something that is very new in Barbados, I am looking now at all the different pieces of legislation. I'm not an attorney, sir. I'm not as gifted as you. Some attorneys are not as gifted as you. But I am not an attorney, Mr. Speaker, sir. And I spend my nights reading the law, looking at what other people are doing across the world as they attempt to implement policies that make the most of the ocean, but at the same time, do so in a way that is sustainable. Yeah, we're working. And I do so, sir, because at the end of the day, the ministry will be responsible for taking it forward. It is a shift in the paradigm that allows an organization to do some of this work and say, this is what is happening on the world stage, perhaps we should consider this. And to me, in a 2018 Barbados, that makes a lot of sense. And for that reason, and for the many other reasons, but for that reason, sir, I believe that we are duty-bound to support it. Now, let me tell you about some of the legislation that I am dealing with. We just had an audit by the International Maritime Organization in relation to our shipping. The Shipping Act that governs Barbados is from 1994. The world, we would admit, sir, in the last 6 plus 18, 24 years, has changed. We haven't made a lot of amendments. And in the adjustments that the IMO was saying to Barbados, there were a number of things pertaining to our legislation. Now that we've reviewed them, a lot of them make sense. And it just means that somebody has to be responsible for making these things happen. And I am thankful that we would have an organization. Perhaps if this organization that the AG is speaking of were in existence before, we would know that we had already fallen short before we fell short. So it is a proactive measure in that sense. Mr. Speaker, sir, the Fisheries Act is from 1993 and trying to govern a modern fishing industry. It does not fit. And as the Prime Minister says, it has to be fit for purpose. And it is not. And so it is important that we review this legislation. But Mr. Speaker, sir, legislation with which you will be more familiar, I'm sure, is the Child Care Act. That is from 1969. Amended in 1985 or so, but it is old legislation trying to guide a country that is trying to be a modern country. Sir, these are things that we have to do. And these, sir, are adjustments that we have to make. And the Honourable Attorney General was also very clear when he spoke, when he said that this new body will not replace the CPC, that it will serve in a way to complement it. and that we can have these two agencies coexisting to make Barbados fit for purpose. We know that there was a time when a lot of the things that govern Barbados and was almost a gentleman's agreement. Two people meet, they shake hands and they walk away, everybody good. And those days are gone, especially in Bridgetown. Those days are gone, sir. And there are a lot of things that we know must come here and legislate. And I am pleased to hear the Honourable AG say that people will be allowed...
I would appreciate, sometimes you are speaking to the uninformed.
Yes, sir.
So that when you use the term CPC, the listening public might not be aware of what CPC stands for. So it'd be within your interest and the Chamber's interest to clarify that rather than say AG.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. You're absolutely right. AG, sir, is, as you would know, sir, and to the public, is the Attorney General, and the CPC to which I speak is the Chief Parliamentary Counsel, sir. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, sir. But, Mr. Speaker, sir, the new body will not replace the Chief Parliamentary Counsel. We will still have our legislation done, but it will serve in a way to make us fit for purpose. And, you know, I had made a note, again, when the Honourable Leader of the Opposition spoke. He spoke about the need to democratize structures of ownership, and that he had hoped our situation of need and debt would not bring us to the point that would make us fall victim to the interests that run contrary in a way to that which what Barbados needs and Barbadian interests. Hey, that is not what is here. I am saying, Mr. Speaker, sir, that the legislation before the House, guided predominantly by Barbadian interests, to advance Barbadian interests, is unlikely to have this kind of effect. Oh, you are entitled to have, Mr. Speaker, sir, you're entitled to raise on a point of order.
Please, no cross-talk, please.
Yes, sir.
Address the chair.
The words that were used by the Honourable Leader of the Opposition was that he would hope our situation of need and debt did not bring us to a point that made us fall victim to these international interests.
Point of order, Honourable Member. Michael.
The Honourable Member, my good friend.
Is a point of elucidation.
He's misleading the House, that if I may elucidate. All I'm saying is, he's misleading the House.
Point of order, please.
Point of order, he's misleading the House.
Could you explain the point of order here?
He is suggesting that I've said to this Parliament and the public of Barbados by way of this Parliament and the privilege of standing here and speaking before you, sir, that the legislation brought here today will in some way facilitate the expression of sectoral interest to their advantage over the wider national interest. I'm not saying any such thing. All I'm saying, and he said this about 3-4 times now, all I am saying is that when we're framing laws, when we're making laws, we're always conscious of the fact that there are interests about us that would want to have their own way, both local and international. I'm fully supportive of what the Attorney General has presented here today. Fully supportive.
Continue, our member, Michael.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, sir. I perhaps was of the view that when the Honourable Leader of the Opposition was speaking to the issue at hand, that he was actually speaking to the issue at hand. And the reality is, and the words that were used was that our values, well, his words were that in a way, we cannot have a situation where our need and the debt bring us to that point. That's what was said. And in any event, Mr. Speaker, sir, the reality is that this legislation before us serves to bring us closer to that which is distinctly Barbadian. To be constantly monitoring the laws, to be constantly looking out into the horizon and seeing what is happening, to shape it in a way that allows us to do that which is Barbadian. I've been in this honourable chamber now for a few months. And I have listened to contributions made by various people. I've heard all kinds of innuendo. I've heard innuendo about the government paying people $300,000 as consultants, when the government ain't paying no $300,000 to nobody as consultants. I have heard, sir, honourable members in this House speaking and making associations between two things that would give the impression that one follows the other. And in many cases, it is not the case. And the legislation that is now before this House will serve to strengthen the Barbadian hand and not to weaken it. And I feel that that is a very important point. Our values will drive who we are. At the end of the day, that which makes us Barbadian will obtain and will continue to obtain. And we will continue to serve in the interest of the people who have elected us. And sir, I think when I look at what we have done, Mr. Speaker, sir, when I look at what we've done in relation to being able to face an international monetary fund, and on the eve of facing the International Monetary Fund, bring legislation in this House to protect the most vulnerable, to offer and increase the pensioners. The Honourable Member for St. George South soon bringing his trust loans to give rise to the reality that poor people could be empowered even in these conditions. Everything, every piece of legislation, all that we have done to protect Barbadian interests and at the same time to protect the most vulnerable who could be affected by the things that are happening in this country. And I must remind the Honourable House, sir, that these things were not things that were done by this Barbados Labour Party. The things that we are fighting against were done by the other government, and we are serving to make wrong things right. And Mr. Speaker, so I believe that is the context within which we must have debates, and the context within which we must have conversation. This is what we bring for conversation and for discussion. This is what we put out to the public. We want the Barbadian people to be driven by hope, sir, and by ambition, sir, and to believe that they live in a Barbados where their dreams can become a reality. We do not want to create a Barbados where people feel fearful when they don't necessarily have to feel fear. But that is not the kind of government that we wish to be. And I would believe that is not the kind of opposition that anybody would wish to be. At the end of the day, we are serving, sir, in the people's interests. And that is all that we came here to do. And sir, I wish to support in the strongest terms this bill that was brought by the Honourable Attorney General. I wish to remain, as the Prime Minister always says, true to purpose, and with a view that this government must remain faithful to the people who elected this government. And that I believe, sir, all that we have done will do so, and I am confident that this bill, when it is passed and become part of the law of Barbados, will serve to do so as well. I am obliged, sir. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, sir, I move to have the House suspended for lunch until 2:30 this afternoon.
The question is that this Honourable House be suspended until 2:30 p.m. All those honourable members in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Those against, please say no. We think the ayes have it. This Honourable Chamber is adjourned until 2:30 p.m.